On this week's episode of the Milk Making Minutes, you hear a story of a mom of 3 who went into breastfeeding with the stated goal of making it 6 months and ended up breastfeeding her children well into toddlerhood. You will hear a story that highlights the importance of doing your own breastfeeding research because time and time again, medical professionals give misinformation that is not based on evidence, but rather on their own preconceived notions about breastfeeding. But you don't have to do it alone. You can find medical professionals like lactation supporters, lactation consultants, lactation counselors who can help you. You will grow in your own confidence and feel more ready to trust your own research as you hear how Emily did the same. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I have become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. Many of my clients are surprised by their own self-doubt and anxiety over every baby feeding decision. And in the years that I've been connecting with people during pregnancy and breastfeeding, I've seen time and time again that those anxieties are reduced through hearing from others about their experiences without judgment or fear. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh. I invite you to sit back and listen in to reduce your breastfeeding anxiety through explorations of real-life breastfeeding. Hi, Emily. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi, nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so take a minute to introduce yourself and your family.
So I'm Emily, and I live in North Dakota, and I'm married to my husband for 7 years this year, and I have 3 children. My oldest is 5, my middle is 3, and my youngest is 18 months.
Okay, awesome. So before we really get into your own breastfeeding stories, I would love to know what your exposure to breastfeeding was before you were doing it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So my mom and my mother-in-law breastfed. My mom breastfed my sister, not me. She couldn't. I had a really severe tongue tie and it was never clipped. So she couldn't breastfeed with me. And I always knew that, but she breastfed my sister till she was 3. And then my mother-in-law breastfed all of her kids. So I had a lot of familial support, which was amazing. And I knew I wanted to breastfeed before I had my first, but I really had the expectation of 6 months tops. I had told my mom when we talked about it before having my first, I had said, I absolutely do not want to go over a year and we'll see if I make it to 6 months. So I had low expectations for myself, which was fine. I think that honestly probably helped me because I wasn't pressuring myself to meet any milestones other than just giving it a try.
Why do you think you had that 6-month expectation? Where did that come from?
I really think like doctors and everything I had read or heard about breastfeeding previous really said the first 6 months were like the most beneficial. I say that in quotations. But for me, that just sounded like a solid, good enough for my viewpoints. I was really where I thought would be the most likely to stop. And so my doctor kind of said was most people breastfeed to 6 months. I took a breastfeeding class and they had not really talked about breastfeeding past 6 months as well. So that's just kind of where I set the expectation for myself.
I asked Emily what her doctors and other medical professionals were telling her she would feed the baby between 6 months and 12 months. She told me they were supportive of breastfeeding, but always made it clear that formula was an option at any point too. She also provided this information about how her experience working in a daycare shaped her views on breastfeeding.
I had worked in a daycare setting for 2 years before having my first, and I had seen the difficulty of a lot of women to maintain or to continue pumping for their kiddos in daycare. And so really, I didn't see myself at that time breastfeeding any longer than that. I just didn't know if it was going to be possible. And I think I had sort of almost a prejudice against the idea of breastfeeding longer than that. I remember having a discussion with my mom, and I was like, well, they don't need it anymore after a year. And my mom, who had breastfed my sister till she was 3, said, okay. She was she was never negative about it, but she was like, what are you going to do if they don't want to stop? And I was like, that won't be an issue. I'll just tell them no. It was very funny because I've breastfed all my kids to 3 as well.
Right.
He was still breastfeeding.
Yeah.
So in retrospect, a little laughable, but
you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wow. So you had your mom kind of countering that message a little bit. Was there anybody else who was? Was there anybody else you knew? Any peers who had breastfed children longer than 6 months or that you knew?
I had my kiddos fairly young. I was 20 with my oldest.
Oh, wow.
And so the majority of my friends at that time, they still don't have children, which is fantastic. Like I've met amazing mom friends, and I've met a lot of women after the fact who do breastfeed and have breastfed past 6 months. But at the time, other than my mom and my mother-in-law, I had pretty much no other support for that at all.
So we know what your expectations about breastfeeding were. You wanted to breastfeed for 6 months. You had this idea that you would do that. And then potentially, did you know that you would need to give some sort of non-cow's milk supplement if you did not continue past 6 months?
Yes.
Okay. And did you know that that would mean some sort of weaning process?
So with my first, it was kind of not a terrible start to breastfeeding, but he also had a tongue tie, which was clipped in the hospital. But I was told by the nurse, who we don't have lactation consultants at the time in our hospital or in our town at all. So the nurse there told me I had flat nipples and that I wouldn't be able to breastfeed without a nipple shield. So she gave me the nipple shield. And again, my mom's fantastic. She's been a great resource through everything. She looked at me and she goes, Emily, you definitely don't need this. And I was like, I do though. The nurse told me I do. I do. I need this. And my mom, who is a speech pathologist, so she also works with like nursing babies and stuff. But the nurse told me I needed a nipple shield though. So I'm going to use it. And I did. And I nursed with the nipple shield with my youngest until he was 7 months. And during that
wow, that's a long time to use a nipple shield.
It was a very long time.
Yeah.
And very stressful because it made nursing so much more complicated because it's a whole process of making sure you always have it with you everywhere you go and making sure it's on right, making sure you can have one if it rips, an extra one if it rips, or if you lose it, making sure it's disinfected after you're done. It's a whole extra process. And
then putting it on, if you're nursing publicly, putting it on discreetly before you get the baby latched. You know, it's hard enough not to flash your nipples to everybody.
Absolutely.
When that seems to be such a big deal to people. And then to try to put a nipple shield on top of that.
Yeah. And so during that time, I went back to work at the daycare where my son went to because I was working at the daycare during that time. I had pumped incredibly fast. I had gone back to work with like 200 ounces pumped.
Wow.
I am an overproducer, but I went back to work with that pumped there. I pumped once a day because the director I worked with let me if I needed to, but made comments about it all the time. So I chose to just pump on my lunch break.
Wow.
And I couldn't keep up with the
And that's at a daycare.
Yeah, that was at a daycare, which was really hard because I could hear him. I wasn't in the same room as him, but I could hear him get upset. I could hear him, have his nursing cry, and I couldn't do anything about it. And so I ended up starting supplementing with formula because I couldn't keep up with the demand because they were feeding him 6, 7-ounce bottles at a time as a 3, 4 month old. And now, looking back, I know that they just weren't pace feeding him and they weren't providing like the kind of nursing experience from a bottle that helps with breastfeeding.
Yes.
But at the time, I didn't know. So I honestly had considered just fully stopping breastfeeding and going only to formula. And because I felt like I just could not keep up. I felt like all I wanted to do was cry when I pumped because I never had enough to give what the next day would be at the daycare. And I was really, really just ready to be done. But I let myself just come to terms with only doing formula at daycare and then just nursing at home. And when he was 5 months old, that was what we were doing. And then I had decided my husband got a raise at work and we had figured things out. And so I was able to stay at home. And we decided that was the best course of action. And so we went into staying home around 5 months when he was 5 months old, with still doing formula occasionally and then nursing pretty much any other time. And then that is when I found out at around 8 months, when he was 8 months old, that I was pregnant. And I had just kind of gotten into the hang of really, really nursing him. And he was doing really, really good. We got rid of the nipple shield. He had been handling everything well. And then I found out I was pregnant and I was not sure what to do. So I did a lot of research about, can I breastfeed through pregnancy? Because he did not want to stop at all. So when I found out I was pregnant with my second, and I had done research on my own about nursing through pregnancy and then tandem nursing. I didn't plan on tandem nursing, but at least until my oldest was 1, I really wanted to stick with until he was 1, which wasn't very far away, so it was okay. And then when he hit 1 and he had no inclination of stopping, then I was like, well, we'll just see where this goes. And we did. I nursed through my entire pregnancy. And I did.
Emily felt so confident about tandem nursing because she had done her research that she never even discussed it with her doctor. The thought never crossed her mind. She told this story of a conversation with a nurse who not only gave her wrong information, but made her doubt herself and the decision she had so carefully made for her family.
And I remember going back to the hospital for the 3-day checkup that they do and weigh and everything. And I was talking to one of the nurses about everything going on. And she asked how feeding had been, and he had a weighted feed and he was doing great and he was gaining weight. And I had told her that I was also nursing my oldest. And she was shocked that I didn't miscarry my middle child. Oh, okay. Interesting. And then she was also shocked that I had enough milk for both of them because she was convinced that my oldest would drink all of the milk that I had and then my baby wouldn't have any. And neither of those were issues at all. And now I know, looking back and doing more research, that they're not even a likelihood, and nursing through pregnancy is perfectly safe for the majority of women, and that the amount of milk you make is perfectly enough for 2 kids. Especially, twin mamas manage to do it all the time. They're fantastic. But otherwise, it was really disconcerting for me, though, because I felt like all of a sudden I wasn't doing everything right. I had thought I hit kind of that point where I was handling nursing both of them well. I had no issues with either of it. I was really proud of myself. And then I felt like I was doing it wrong and that I was putting my kids in danger. I was risking my entire pregnancy. And then afterward, I was risking my middle kid starving, even though weighted feeds, wet diapers, everything said otherwise. I was so worried about it. And so I was just so flabbergasted by that I just didn't know what to think. So then I actually did more research and found out that a lot of the information I had been given at the hospital and clinics that we have where I live was extremely inaccurate. And then I decided to join a breastfeeding group to help other women in my community. Whether I didn't know if I wanted to join Let You League or Breastfeeding USA or another type of organization. I eventually ended up joining Breastfeeding USA. And that's where I met you. That's where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a great experience. And I've actually been able to help so many women in my area and other areas, which has been fantastic. But I would never have done that if I would have taken my doctors and the nurses I had dealt with their advice and their opinions at face value instead of looking up things on my own.
Right. And at that point, what she was giving you was an opinion. It was not evidence-based information.
Exactly.
And it's really disheartening that you were feeling proud and everything was going well. And she planted a seed of doubt.
Exactly. I think we set up so many people for failure without even trying. I know every single time I've been in the hospital, we had a sheet to fill out after having a baby that they want you to record every single feeding. And they want you to record every single diaper change and for good reason in some of it, to make sure baby's getting enough milk and that they're not dehydrated and that they are having enough input output. I understand it, but in some instances, it sets women up to feeling so much anxiety around the whole concept of breastfeeding. And then they feel like, oh, it's coming up. I gotta write it down. I gotta know exactly when the baby ate last in order to make sure that they're on a schedule. And it does. It sets up women for a lot of situations where they feel like they're not doing enough, or that they feel like that anxiety about feedings, not even on a physical level because they're doing everything right, but on a mental level of knowing that it's coming up and like counting down the minutes, or like being worried that their baby is sleeping and it's time to feed them, but their baby isn't ready to nurse. And then nursing doesn't go well because the baby isn't ready to nurse, or the baby runs to nurse too early. And they feel like it's...
And I have to hold them off. Right. Yeah. Right. Tuning into the schedule or tuning into what I've been told to do instead of the baby does create more anxiety. And it's hard because we do give people guidelines as well.
Yeah, it is hard.
It's hard. It's hard to strike the balance of like, these are the general things you can try and trust yourself and trust your baby.
And it's hard.
And here are the places you can go where you're going to find the most evidence-based support.
Yes.
If you need help. If when you're trusting yourself, you feel like something's not right because we didn't grow up seeing breastfeeding all around us all the time.
Exactly. Exactly. And especially living in an area with extremely minimal breastfeeding supports. It's something I see a lot more now than even 5 years ago with my oldest.
Do you love to read about pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding? Are you looking for books to help you become a more confident parent? Or perhaps books to help you understand what went wrong with your breastfeeding journey or to do better next time with breastfeeding? Or do your kids have questions about breastfeeding or pregnancy, but you don't really know how to answer them? Would you prefer to have a curated list on these topics? Go to the link in the show notes to my new affiliated bookshop. Every purchase you make benefits the Milk Making Minutes. But better than that, these books are vetted. I've read them all, and I feel very confident recommending them to you. I'll be adding to them continuously, so go to that link when you want to purchase a book. It will help the show, and you can feel confident it will be a purchase you will enjoy. Okay, so your tandem
nursing your older child who is now probably like a year and a half?
Yeah, he was 16 months old when I had my youngest.
Okay. And you're getting this advice from the nurse. And was this continuous like every time you went, or did you kind of learn just not to talk about nursing your oldest?
Pretty much. I had never had any continual comments about it, really.
Okay.
It was just when I was in the hospital the one time, which was really, really nice. My doctor that we had picked as my OB doctor, we saw also as my son's, at this time, their primary doctor, was totally fine with it. He was great. He didn't really give me much information, but he was very supportive in whatever I needed to do. He was great about that. So he had no worries whatsoever. He just wrote it down, said, okay, all right, sounds good.
Okay,
when we
good.
brought it up.
Yeah. So not necessarily a wealth of information, but not unsupportive either.
Exactly.
Okay.
Though the biggest issue I had breastfeeding my second, which was significantly easier than the first go around.
Okay.
But I remember being, I want to say 2 months postpartum, probably not even 2 months postpartum. And I remember doing stuff with him, and he was a November baby. So it was colder. It was winter.
Mhm.
And I would go in and out of the buildings to go shopping or like to go places. And I would all of a sudden have severe pain in my breast. It was awful. And then it would go away. And I was so confused. And it was so
While you were
sad.
not nursing,
Not nursing. Just going about my stuff, especially when I was outside or especially in a cooler environment. And I just remember being in such pain with that. It was not fun.
And it was like a shooting pain?
Yeah, shooting pain through my nipples, through my entire breast. And I was so concerned because it really started. And then that same weekend it started, I ended up in urgent care because I was very concerned I had mastitis, even though I didn't have any other symptoms of mastitis. I remember going in, and then, of course, it's a walk-in clinic. And so they have very minimal experience with breastfeeding to begin with. And they were like, well, you're not running a fever. There's no lumps. You're doing okay. Like, honestly, it doesn't look like thrush. Maybe you just need a better bra. I remember just being like, this is not a better bra issue. Like, it is very painful when I have them, and then they're gone, and then I feel fine.
And so, how long did the pain last?
For each time, it was around maybe a minute.
Okay. Okay.
So very short, but very intense pain.
Yeah.
And I remember that next week going into my primary and finding out that actually I had Renault syndrome in my breasts, which basically cuts off the blood supply in my nipples, kind of. I think that's the best way to describe it. And so it's kind of like anything cold, it's severe cold. And it translates to a lot of pain in that area and lack of blood flow in that area. And so it really didn't affect my nursing journey at all, but it's something I found out and was able to treat with keeping warm packs on me, like little hand warmers on me when I went outside in the cold. And then in the summer, it really, really did pretty much disappear unless I was somewhere extremely cold after being somewhere extremely warm. But that was the biggest issue I had breastfeeding my second. And it was a very minimal one. But again, I wish we would have had more breastfeeding training on a grand level of healthcare versus only having specific people know about it. Right. Because I felt very discouraged again, being told I needed a better bra when it was something that was actually wrong.
Right. Yeah. You actually had a diagnosable syndrome. So it's Raynaud syndrome. And do you ever feel severe cold in your fingertips and toes when you're outside?
I do. Yeah. In the winter.
Always experienced?
It was. I just didn't know what it was. I was a figure skater growing up, and I thought it was very, very normal. for you to lose absolutely all of the blood flow in your toes and fingers after being on the ice. I just thought that was a thing. Like, I was like, oh, my fingers are white. My toes are white. It's normal. Like, that's just a thing. It's not. It's also that same thing. But I didn't realize what it was until after I got the diagnosis. Wow.
And who diagnosed you? What type of healthcare professional?
My primary doctor.
Your primary care.
Yes.
Okay.
But he was fantastic. He's currently not. He moved, but he was really, really great about listening to everything I had to say. And then if he didn't know what to do, he would consult other doctors. So
okay.
that's a great kind of doctor.
Yeah. So you never experienced symptoms of Raynaud's in your breasts with your first?
No, I did not. Now, after having all three, the most severe symptoms I have are really early on in breastfeeding journey. Like the first 6 months are the hardest, I would say, with experiencing those symptoms for me anyway. And my oldest is a summer baby. And so I really didn't go out into that like 0-degree weather with him until he was significantly older, or on my own even, because he was a July baby versus November.
Right.
My youngest is January. And so for my youngest and my middle, I definitely experienced more of that because it was significantly more prevalent in the first 6 months. And those were,
yes,
I experienced the cold the most.
Because you were closer to the winter months. Yeah. And that would make sense because milk supply and blood regulation are closely interrelated. And so Raynaud's is a blood flow syndrome. And so if it's more affected in the cold weather, then of course that you're going to feel that more severely.
Yeah. So that was the hardest thing I had to deal with, other than the misinformation with my second.
Yeah. And how long did it take from when you started to feel the symptoms and you're like, oh my gosh, this is horrible, to when you finally got an answer from your primary care? How long did that take?
Around a week. It wasn't too terrible, luckily.
Okay.
Again, while we have a lot of cons of living in a very small, not really rural, but a smaller area, we do get it. Like, it is very easy to get in to a doctor here, which is
Okay.
great.
Okay.
It isn't a time-consuming experience, which is.
But also that was, a lot of people suffer in silence without getting answers. And so you knew, you trusted your body. And you said, okay, I went to one healthcare provider. They told me to get a better fitting bra. That's BS. I know.
I was kind of shocked when they told me that. I was like, I don't think that has anything to do with what I'm experiencing. But okay.
Right. Yeah. You're wrong. I'm going to seek out better information. And you didn't stop because you knew that what you're experiencing was more than the answers you were getting. Yeah. And I like to always call that out for people when they have sought out their answers. I'm sure you do that too when you're working with people with Breastfeeding USA. It's so important for us to call this out for each other because we're having to forge our own paths here when it comes to breastfeeding. And I think it's important to say we have to trust our instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. And if you can't figure out the answer, keep working until you do, because usually there is an answer. Yeah. And, sometimes we can't figure it out, but know that you're not crazy.
Yes. And it's hard not to. I think being a woman in healthcare in general, I feel sometimes it's almost the universal experience where you feel something's wrong. And a lot of times it's brushed off. But you have to trust that you know your own body and that if you feel something is wrong, something is wrong. I know so many women, not necessarily in the breastfeeding scope, but in like women's health and then in other, obviously just general health situations where they've felt something is wrong and they've gone to the doctor and the doctors don't listen to them or they brush it off as something like your diet needs to change or you need to lose weight. And it ends up being a severe issue that needed to be dealt with immediately.
Yeah.
But because their doctors didn't listen to them or just brushed off their concerns, it ended up getting worse than it needed to be in the first place. I think being able to listen to your body and be intuitive about what your body needs is being endangered. I want to say endangered based on the anxiety that society in general pushes on mothers about breastfeeding, that they have so many ideas about what they need to do in order to be successful or productive as breastfeeding individuals, that almost replaces their own intuitive knowledge of what is wrong in their body. And so it's so much harder to listen to yourself and to trust yourself when you're being hammered with messages of things you don't need to be even worried about. I know I deal quite frequently with women who are so concerned about having an extremely large stash of milk before going back to work. But we send all these messages to especially new mothers about what breastfeeding should look like, that almost takes over what we allow ourselves to feel and what we allow ourselves to know is right as individuals, like through our own instincts, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's so hard. It's so hard to balance our own instincts with living in a society where the instinct doesn't always get passed down because we're not surrounded by it.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and then having that anxiety of being thrust into a world that you have no knowledge of.
Right.
Hard. It's not normalized and it's seen as odd in a lot of people's mind frames because we have such a narrow idea of breastfeeding in some instances. And just having, like, seeing other people do that makes such a difference, I think, for women who, like myself, who didn't think about even breastfeeding past a year, wasn't even on my radar because even though I had that experience with my mom doing that and had that support, I didn't see it ever. And it wasn't considered normal and it wasn't considered like typical of women to breastfeed that long.
Going back to your story, what was your experience like then? So you have your oldest, you have your baby, you now have been diagnosed with Raynaud's, which helps you to understand that better. And then when did you get pregnant with your youngest?
Yeah, so I got pregnant with my youngest the summer of 2020. And it was, yeah. So I had him during the pandemic, right when it started picking up. Luckily, it kind of, in where I'm at, kind of mellowed out a little bit when I had him, which was great. But I had just weaned my oldest 2 months prior
to getting pregnant.
Yeah. Okay. Finding out I was pregnant. And so I had literally just finished. And that was a significantly easier process than I thought it was going to be. He had just turned 3. And he had really only been nursing during nap time or to go to bed. And so it was a significantly easier process of just offering a glass of milk or offering him a snack instead. And he very easily decided he was okay being done on his own. And it was significantly less stressful than I thought it was going to be because I was worried because he did love nursing and he was very attached to me in that way. And so I feel if I had done any earlier than that, it would have been significantly more stressful. But because he was at an age where I could reason with him and offer other alternatives, it was so easy.
Yeah.
It was so easy. And I figured, even though my middle was 18 months old, about 18 months old when I found out I was pregnant. And so I figured I would end up doing the same thing. And I did. I ended up breastfeeding through my entire pregnancy with my last. And I ended up nursing my middle until he was 3. And I actually just weaned him, I want to say, 4 months ago now, 5 months ago, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was a pretty easy experience doing that too, because he was like when they're at an age where they can reason. I think he had one night where he was really sad about it and he cried about it, and we had extra snuggles and did extra fun things together and had extra time. But for the most part, it was very uneventful, very easy, and very minimal drama with weaning.
And for both of them, you decided to wean because you were feeling ready.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I was ready. With my oldest, I was just feeling ready to be done. He was nursing once a day. And I was just really, really ready to be done. And he was fine with that. He really was. He talked about it a little bit. We got a book about it. And then he was okay being done. And with my middle, I ended our nursing journey together because I ended up having thrush again. With my youngest, I ended up having thrush quite a bit. And I had gotten it again, and I did not want to nurse and treat everyone again. And so I was like, this is it. I'm done. I can't do this with all of you guys. And it's not comfortable to nurse with thrush at all.
No.
And so that was when I was like, we have to be done. And I was like, maybe we can revisit this after, like we can go back to it after I'm cleared up. But he never made any signs that he needed to go back to nursing anymore. So I was like, that's fine. We can be done.
Yeah.
So that was the reasoning behind weaning. But they had really been showing signs that they were getting very, very close to being done. They had never nursed more than once a day, maybe. They had gone days sometimes where they didn't nurse. And so they were very close to being probably done on their own.
But you just had to push them out a little.
Yeah,
push them out of the nest.
And that worked out really, really well for me. I feel, obviously, I haven't weaned my youngest yet, but I feel like that has been a really positive experience. And I don't feel regret over it or upset over any of that other weaning process, which has been really nice because I was very worried about that for a while with both of them.
Any other major things that you dealt with your third that come to mind?
Yeah. So funny enough, I had never really experienced thrush with my first two ever. And so with my third, he ended up having a really, really chronic set of ear infections. And then he was on an antibiotic for them and then on a new antibiotic, and it was bad. Like the poor kiddo just annihilated his stomach from being on antibiotics for so long. But with that came thrush with him, and then that transferred to me. And we ended up going through thrush 3 times together.
So horrible.
And for him, it really never presented much. Like, I tried the first time. I told the doctor, I was like, I think he has thrush. And they checked his mouth and they're like, I don't think so. And I'm like, I think he has thrush because look at me. And they were like, oh yeah, you have thrush.
Yeah.
So,
again, you trusted yourself. You didn't just take your answer. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, no, for real. I'm bleeding. I have cracked nipples. I have scaly dry skin around my nipples. And it's bad. And so I knew what it was because of my experience working with other women who have had thrush. And then when we discussed it in a lot of our training and stuff. So I pretty much knew what I was dealing with, but I had never actually physically dealt with it. And so it was very interesting. And I feel so bad for us, especially brand new moms who have to deal with it, because I know myself, I knew what I had to do to get rid of it. I was doing all the things to get rid of it. I knew it would go away, but I was really wanting to throw in the towel some days when it was bad. And it was so painful.
And did it ever prevent your youngest from nursing or
him? No,
he wasn't in pain.
Prevented me from wanting to nurse him.
Right. Yeah.
Because it was very uncomfortable. Luckily, it never bothered him. Like, he was very unbothered by it. And every single time we've had it, he doesn't really present with any of the symptoms other than he might have like a diaper rash, maybe.
Okay.
But other than that, he doesn't really present with anything. So he never had any of that like severe like uncomfortability in the mouth or anything that you occasionally look for with thrush. So that was interesting to deal with. And it is something that isn't really talked about as much as like mastitis or clogged ducts or even just regular cracked nipples.
And so you would go through a full round of treatment for both you and for him for thrush, and it still wouldn't go away?
No, his thrush, luckily, it did clear up pretty quickly. But it's something like you have to make sure that every article of clothing you've worn during that time has to be like completely bleached. Well, not even bleached, but like put out in the sun and like completely washed thoroughly. Like even things you don't think about, like blankets or like snuggly fun things, like all the stuffed animals, because if they had any of it on it, it could give it right back to you. And then at this time, even though I hadn't been leaking for a really long time, I ended up wearing nursing pads as well because it was so uncomfortable to have anything rubbing on you. And so having that cushion there helped a lot. And so that was a trying experience. And like I said, I really feel, especially for women who that's their first experience with breastfeeding, to have that pain, because like I said, this was my third baby and I had breastfed for a long time. And I was at the point where I'm like, if this doesn't get better within the next week, I don't really want to do this much anymore. Because it's
Yeah, absolutely. That's so helpful. Well, Emily, thank you so much. This has been so awesome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So appreciate you helping us. Do you want to share what you mentioned a breastfeeding coalition that you're a part of?
Yeah,
what is that coalition?
Yeah, no problem. I'm a part of the James River Breastfeeding Coalition.
Okay.
Jamestown, North Dakota. I'm also part of the North Dakota Breastfeeding Coalition. And that is the statewide one that we have. It's based in Bismarck, North Dakota. I'm also part of Breastfeeding USA as a breastfeeding counselor and on the community engagement board. And I also offer counseling to women, not only in my area, but I deal with quite a few throughout the Midwest. So my information is available, I think, on the Breastfeeding USA website if you ever need to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Good. We'll tag all of your information in the show notes, for all those links in the show notes so that people can get a hold of you or get a hold of the coalition if they would like.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
This has been awesome. Thanks.
Emily's story is one that reminds us to once again seek the supporters and the sources of information that will build our confidence in our bodies to birth and feed our babies. That can really make or break your breastfeeding experience. So whether you are preparing a first breastfeeding experience or thinking back on experiences past, take a moment to reflect on the people and resources that made you feel more confident that you could feed your baby. What did they say and do? Maybe you can be that person for someone else.